Did the U.S. government erase the identities of fallen Vietnam soldiers? This film investigates that chilling possibility. On a humid night in Washington, the black granite of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial glows like water. Fingers trace letters, reflections blur into the stone, and somewhere in that sea of names, a family swears there was one more, a name they once saw in a casualty ledger, and then never saw again. Across an ocean, and decades earlier, body bags arrived at Tan Son Nhut. Tags clinked, clerks typed, stamps fell. In the chaos of dust and rotor wash, the difference between a name remembered and a life erased could be a smudge of ink, a missing page, a single classified line. Here is one hard truth to anchor us. The unknown from Vietnam at Arlington was later identified by DNA and returned to his family. If one mystery soldier had a name, how many others did too? Off the record? Tonight, we follow a paper trail that flickers in and out of existence. A memo with a redacted order. A list with a gap. A mother who kept a photo and a letter that doesn't match the date. Somewhere a file says, "Remove from public roll pending review," and stops. Why did it stop there? The name that vanished. It began with a mother's voice, trembling through the crackle of a phone line in 1971. "He was there. I saw his name," she whispered. "Now it's gone." Her son, Corporal Daniel Reeves, had been declared killed in action outside Quang Tri, his unit ambushed in the jungle. Weeks later, his name appeared in the casualty list printed by Stars and Stripes. Friends sent condolences. The local newspaper ran his photo. Smiling, 22, holding a guitar on the base steps. Then one morning, when his mother opened the paper again, his name wasn't there. It had been quietly removed, as if the war itself had changed its mind. At first, she thought it was a mistake. A reprint, maybe. But when she wrote to the Army, the letter she received back was brief. "Records indicate your son's status remains under review." Under review. No explanation. No apology. Just those two words. For months she waited for a correction, a call, a coffin. None came. Only silence, and a growing sense that something wasn't right. Half a world away, in a temporary records office at Long Bin, the night clerk yawned under the hum of a single fluorescent light. His fingers were black with carbon paper ink, his desk stacked with casualty tags and forms coded DA 1300. He flipped through the day's entries: 23 new KIAs, 12 MIAs, 4 bodies awaiting confirmation. He paused at a familiar name: Reeves, Daniel M. The status beside it was crossed out. Next to it, a faint stamp. Hold, Directive 10A. The clerk frowned. That stamp was rare. Usually it meant someone in intelligence had intervened, or that a record had been flagged for security sensitivity. That night, he slipped a carbon copy of Reeves' form into his satchel, maybe out of guilt or curiosity or both. He never told anyone why. Decades later, that same copy would resurface in a dusty box in a Virginia attic, creased, yellowed, still bearing the faint ink of the red hold. In the years after the war, Daniel Reeves' mother never stopped writing. She kept a notebook filled with letters, one every month, addressed to every office she could find: the Pentagon, the Department of the Army, the Defense POW Accounting Agency. Most went unanswered. One came back marked recipient unknown. Her penmanship, neat at first, grew shaky over time. The last entry was dated 1982. "If he's gone, I can live with that. But please, don't let him disappear twice." The story might have ended there, buried in the paper dust of history, if not for a young archivist named Eleanor Shaw. In 1999, she was cataloging declassified Vietnam-era casualty documents when she found a gap, a blank space in the 1971 Army KIA microfilm roll. File numbers jumped abruptly, as if several entries had been sliced away. Curious, she cross-checked the corresponding registry cards. A few were missing, including one with the last readable name, Reeves. When she reported it to her supervisor, he dismissed it. "Clerical issue," he said. "Nothing sinister." But Eleanor knew enough to be suspicious. She'd seen clerical errors before. They left traces, misnumbered lines, corrections, not vanishings. This was different. The data simply ceased to exist. Weeks later, a brown envelope arrived at her home address, unmarked except for a faint military postmark. Inside was a photocopy of an old Graves Registration Command log, March 1971. The paper listed body transfers from the Quang Tri Field Morgue. Among them remains, 4721, Reeves, D.M., shipped, 03-12-71. Status, confirmed. A single handwritten note followed below it in red ink. Retract public release. See attached. But there was no attachment. Eleanor began to dig deeper. She traced the chain of custody, from the battlefield to the Central Identification Laboratory in Hawaii, known as Silhi. Most bodies passed through there for processing before repatriation. But in Reeves' case, the log showed a reroute. Transferred to special handling, undisclosed. That phrase appeared only a handful of times in all Vietnam-era files, and each time it did, the accompanying name eventually vanished from public casualty databases. She contacted a retired CLHI technician named Harris, now living in Oregon. Over the phone, he hesitated before speaking. "Special handling wasn't supposed to exist," he said quietly. "It was off-book. We'd get shipments marked with black tags, not white. No names, just numbers. We weren't allowed to open them. Intelligence would come pick them up. Some of us joked those were ghost soldiers. Men who died twice, once on the field and once on paper." When Eleanor asked if he remembered a case tagged 47-21, Harris fell silent. Then he said something that chilled her. "That one. Yeah, the kid with the guitar. They said he wasn't supposed to be here. Said he never existed." From that moment, the story shifted from bureaucratic anomaly to something darker. A missing soldier erased from ledgers, a mother who swore she'd seen his name in print, and a technician who remembered the face of a man whose record said he wasn't real. In early 2001, Eleanor filed a Freedom of Information request for all documents labeled Directive 10A. Months passed before a thin packet arrived, half of it redacted. The opening line read, "Subject, Temporary Classification of Casualty Records, Category D." Then, underlined twice, the phrase, "For operations requiring non-attribution of personnel." Non-attribution. In plain terms, it meant certain individuals' deaths could be concealed if they were part of covert operations or intelligence assets not publicly acknowledged. But Daniel Reeves was a corporal, not a spy. His unit had been standard infantry. So why would his death be handled like a classified mission? Eleanor's research reached a breaking point when she uncovered an internal memo dated May 1971. It referred to identified remains previously attributed to conventional units, reclassified for operational security. Among the redacted names, one line survived. Reeves, KIA. Next to it, another note in cursive. Reassign ID under alternate. The phrase alternate ID was code for something almost unthinkable, the repurposing of a dead soldier's identity. It had happened in earlier wars. Stolen names used for cover, paperwork reused for clandestine personnel. But in Vietnam, where chaos was routine, it could be done without trace. A soldier declared dead could become someone else's alias. A new operative could be born from a casualty list. Eleanor didn't sleep that night. She sat by her window staring at the photocopies spread across the table, the name Reeves glinting faintly under her lamp. She wondered if the mother ever knew, or if the government had buried the truth deeper than any grave. The next morning she called Harris again, but the line was disconnected. She tried his old address. Neighbors said he'd moved suddenly 2 weeks earlier. No forwarding information, just gone. By summer, Eleanor herself began receiving unsigned emails. Stop digging. Directive 10A was never rescinded. She ignored them until one morning, her access to the archives was suspended pending internal review. When she appealed, the response was eerily familiar. Records under review. Years later, That same phrase would echo online when veterans groups began compiling independent casualty lists. Dozens of families wrote in, saying they too had seen names disappear. Entries altered, statuses changed. One father claimed his son's file was marked unresolved, non-disclosure, though the body had been buried decades earlier. The pattern was impossible to ignore, and yet the official stance never changed. Clerical errors, record maintenance, nothing more, but behind the curtain, a quiet truth flickered. The line between honor and secrecy blurred by politics, operations, and time itself. As for Daniel Reeves, no grave under his name has ever been found. His mother's notebook was discovered in an estate sale in 2015. The final line underlined twice. "If I can't find him here, I'll find him there. The pages end there, but not the story." Because somewhere, in a locked room filled with forgotten files, a name once written still waits to be read again. And as the door to Chapter 2 creaks open, one question whispers through the dark. If soldiers can be erased, who decides which ones get remembered? Ghosts in the ledger. The building smelled like paper dust and old air, the kind that settles over forgotten truths. Rows of gray filing cabinets stretched into the dimness like metal gravestones. Each drawer carried a number. Each number a name, or what was left of one. It was here, in the windowless archives of the Army Records Center in St. Louis, that Eleanor Shaw found herself again, 3 months after losing her clearance. She shouldn't have been there, but she had friends who still believed that some names deserved to be found. The room was cold. A single desk lamp glowed across a folder labeled Casualty Ledger, Region 4. Inside were handwritten notations, soldiers, units, dates, causes. But halfway down the 1971 roll, the ink shifted. The handwriting changed. It wasn't the tidy script of a clerk anymore. It was jagged, uneven. Next to certain names, a diagonal slash and a red pencil mark shaped like an X. She ran her finger over one. It read, MIA, reclass. Directive 10A. Her breath caught. It wasn't just Reeves. There were others. Entire clusters of men from the same region. Crossed out, reclassified, and marked for hold. She counted 14 in 1 week alone. The ledger was silent about why, but she noticed something else. All of them were listed under units that had been attached, temporarily, to the 5th Special Forces Group, the same division often used for deep reconnaissance missions that officially never happened. As she turned the pages, a loose note slipped out, folded twice. On it, typed in fading ink, Casualty pattern indicates data scrub at source level. Recommend audit. The signature was illegible. The date read August 1973, months after the ceasefire. Whoever wrote it had noticed the same disappearances and tried to stop them. Outside the building, rain came in sheets. Eleanor clutched the note in her pocket as she hurried through the parking lot. Somewhere behind her, the night guard's flashlight swept across the windows. She didn't look back. 2 days later, she sat in a diner just off Highway 70, opposite a man she'd found through a veterans forum. His name was Paul Crenshaw, a retired logistics officer. 68, heavyset, with nicotine-stained fingers and eyes that didn't blink enough. When she showed him the copied ledger, he stared at it for a long time before speaking. "Those marks," he said quietly, tapping the red X, "weren't mistakes. They were instructions." He told her about something called the Ledger Audit Project. It was set up in the final years of the war, when casualty reports stopped matching field data. Too many soldiers unaccounted for, too many discrepancies between morgue records and burial lists. Crenshaw's team had been ordered to reconcile totals, but each time they found a mismatch, the orders came down from above. Adjust to reflect prior numbers. Do not inquire. When she asked what adjust meant, his voice dropped. Sometimes it meant changing a name to MIA. Sometimes it meant erasing one completely, especially if that person had been reassigned to something classified. You can't have a dead man attached to a unit that's supposed to be invisible. Invisible? The word hung between them. He looked around the diner, then leaned in. You think Reeves was the only one? I saw at least 50 files go dark in 1 month. Whole identities just gone. Like someone took an eraser to history. Eleanor pressed him for evidence, but Crenshaw shook his head. We were told the records would be archived securely. Then one night the trucks came. They said the files were being moved to D.C. for storage. Never saw them again. Do you know who gave the order? She asked. He hesitated. A colonel named Haynes. Everyone reported to him back then. But here's the thing, I checked later. There's no Colonel Haynes listed anywhere in the Army Personnel Directory. Never existed. That name, Haynes, would follow her for weeks, appearing like a ghost in documents that weren't supposed to exist. She found one reference buried in a 1974 internal memo, labeled CID Follow-up, unclassified. It mentioned a J. Haynes authorized to oversee temporary adjustments to casualty documentation. No first name, no rank, only a signature that looked like it had been stamped, not signed. The more she searched, the more resistance she met. Emails bounced. Calls went unanswered. A former Department of Defense employee she contacted refused to speak unless off the record. He said the erasures weren't random. They were part of an optics operation, meant to balance reported losses and reduce public outrage as the war dragged on. They couldn't let the numbers keep rising, he said. Some of those men were written out so others could stay on the books. But then he said something that stopped her cold. And some weren't erased to hide the dead. They were erased because they weren't dead at all. Eleanor's pulse quickened. What do you mean? He hesitated. Sometimes an agent would go deep cover. You'd need to make him disappear from the system. Family's told he's dead. But he's out there somewhere under a new name. Reeves? She whispered. Could be. Or someone who looked enough like him. That possibility turned everything upside down. What if Daniel Reeves hadn't been erased as a casualty, but reborn as someone else? She began tracking aliases tied to operations in 1971. One name kept surfacing, David R. Evans. Same initials, same year, same enlistment region, and a transfer date, March 1971. That matched the day Reeves's remains were supposedly shipped. The trail led to a single personnel file marked Confidential Civil Affairs. It listed Evans as attached to agency operations. Saigon. There was no photo, no birthplace, no next of kin. Just a note. Status terminated. April 1972, Quang Tri Province. Eleanor stared at that sheet for hours, her thoughts circling back to the mother who wrote, "Don't let him disappear twice." What if he hadn't disappeared at all? What if he had been used? Late that night, she drove home in silence, headlights carving tunnels through fog. As she reached her apartment door, she noticed an envelope taped to it. Plain white, no return address. Inside was a single photograph, a group of American soldiers standing beside a Huey helicopter. The jungle loomed behind them, dark and wet. One man stood slightly apart, half-shadowed, holding a guitar. The caption on the back read, Quang Tri, 1972. Eleanor's breath caught. Reeves had been declared dead the year before. She held the photo under the lamp, comparing the face to the newspaper clipping she'd found months earlier. The resemblance was uncanny. Same jawline, same eyes. But the name scrawled across the back, faint and blurred, read Evans. That night, thunder rolled across the city. Eleanor sat by the window again, the photo trembling in her hands. The rain traced streaks down the glass, and for a moment, it looked like tears sliding over the image of the boy with the guitar. She knew what she had to do. There was one place that might still hold the missing link. The joint POW-MIA accounting laboratory in Hawaii. If she could access the mortuary records from March 1971, she might find the truth about remains 47 to 21. But before she could plan her trip, her phone buzzed. An unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. A man's voice, low and calm, spoke on the line. Ms. Shaw, we need to talk. It's about your research. And about Daniel Reeves. Her throat went dry. Who is this? I worked with him, the voice said. But not in Vietnam. A silence stretched, heavy and sharp. Then the line went dead. The next morning, Eleanor found her car window shattered. Nothing stolen, just a note left on the seat. 5 words scrawled in pencil. Some names stay buried forever. She stared at it until the letters blurred, the weight of it pressing down like a shadow she couldn't shake. Somewhere between truth and silence, between the dead and the living, the mystery deepened. And as she lifted her eyes to the gray morning sky, one thought refused to fade. If Daniel Reeves had lived under another name, whose death had been buried in his place? The unknowns, the DNA, and the doors that stayed shut. The ocean air carried a damp chill as Eleanor stepped onto the tarmac in Honolulu. The wind smelled of salt and fuel, mingling with the faint sweetness of plumeria. Ahead of her, beyond the security gate, stood a low gray building, the Joint POW-MIA Accounting Laboratory, known for bringing closure to families who'd waited decades for a name. She hoped it would bring her answers too. Inside, the lights hummed softly above long tables lined with stainless steel trays and bone fragments. Technicians in gloves moved with quiet precision, each motion deliberate, reverent. On the wall, photographs of soldiers, some smiling, some somber, looked down like silent witnesses. Eleanor met with Dr. Malik, a forensic anthropologist who had worked there for nearly 20 years. His voice carried the kind of calm that came from handling death every day. "You're asking about a case from March 1971? He said, scanning her notes. "Remains number 4721? She nodded. "Yes. The file shows it was reclassified for special handling. But I need to know why." He looked uneasy. "That code wasn't ours. It came from Defense Intelligence. They had their own chain of custody. Was it common? No. Rare. Maybe one in several hundred. When we saw that tag, we knew it was off limits. We processed nothing, just logged the arrival and moved it along. To where?" she asked. He hesitated. "I can't say for certain, but there were rumors. A facility on the mainland. Some said it was used for identification experiments before DNA testing was official policy." Her heart beat faster. "Experiments? Let's just say," he replied softly, "not all of our unknowns were unknown." He rose and led her down a narrow hall to a storage vault. He keyed in a code, and the heavy door swung open with a hiss. Inside were rows of metal drawers, each tagged with a number. Malik pulled one open and lifted a small metal tag sealed in plastic. The inscription was faint, but legible. Saturn 47-21. "This," he said, "is all that's left of your case in our system." Eleanor took the tag in her gloved hand. The metal was cool, but she could feel a strange weight behind it, as if it carried every unanswered question she'd asked for years. "There's also a lab note," Malik added. "It's dated 3 months after the tag arrived." He slid a paper from the folder. The handwriting was cramped, hurried. It read, "Sample reassigned. DNA extracted under Protocol 10A. Transfer complete." "DNA extracted?" she whispered. "But in 1971, that technology didn't even exist." Malik nodded slowly. "Exactly. That's what makes it strange. Either the date's wrong, or the procedure wasn't what we think it was." Eleanor felt the ground shift beneath her certainty. The more she uncovered, the less sense it made. Could the sample have been used later, maybe after DNA testing became possible? Malik crossed his arms. If it had been, there should be a cross-reference. But there's nothing. No follow-up, no match, no family notification. It's like the test result was locked away. They stood in silence for a moment, the hum of the refrigeration units filling the air. Then he added quietly, "You know, there was a case like this before. The Vietnam unknown from Arlington. They told us no one could ever identify him. Years later, DNA proved otherwise. Once his name came out, a lot of files suddenly went missing. It's as if someone didn't want a pattern to emerge." Later that afternoon, Eleanor visited the small memorial garden outside the facility. A bronze plaque bore the words, "Until they are home." She sat on the bench, holding her notebook, and thought of Daniel Reeves's mother, of the years she spent writing letters into silence. When she looked up, she saw an elderly man placing a bouquet at the base of the memorial. His uniform jacket hung loosely, the medals gleaming faintly. She hesitated, then approached. "You served?" He nodded. "Recon 71, Quang Tri." Her pulse quickened. "Did you ever hear of a soldier named Reeves? Daniel Reeves?" The man frowned, his gaze distant. "Reeves? Can't say I did. But I remember a guy with a guitar. We called him Bluebird. He used to play in the evenings, just outside camp. One night he was gone. We thought he'd been captured. But a week later, a new guy showed up in civvies, working with the intel team. Looked just like him. Different name, though? Evans, I think." Her breath caught. "David Evans? Yeah, that's it. But he wasn't like us. He had that look, the kind that sees more than it says. One night he told me, 'Some of us don't come back because we were never meant to.' I didn't get it then." Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. "What happened to him?" The veteran's eyes darkened. "Helicopter crash, 1972. Body never recovered. But the mission reports, they were redacted. Even the flight logs were scrubbed clean. We stopped asking questions." As the old man walked away, she stared at the fading horizon. Two men. Same face, different names. One dead, one erased. It was no longer about a clerical error. It was about deliberate rewriting. That night, in her hotel room, she spread her findings across the bed. Names, tags, dates, memos, patterns emerged like ghostly fingerprints. Cases with Directive 10A often had two sets of paperwork. One for public record, one hidden. In each, there were discrepancies in the remains identification. And in several DNA tests conducted years later were sealed for national interest. She clicked open her laptop and searched through public archives. One record caught her eye. A 1984 congressional hearing on personnel accounting practices in Vietnam. Buried in the transcript, a single statement stood out. "Some cases may involve classified reassignments of deceased personnel for purposes of ongoing security operations." She froze. Classified reassignments of the deceased. Her fingers trembled as she read the next line. "These cases shall remain exempt from public release pending review by the Department of Defense." The same phrasing, pending review, that had haunted every letter, every rejection, every unanswered question. It wasn't an accident. It was policy. Outside, the rain began again, tapping against the window like quiet knocks. She tried to push away the unease creeping in, but the question refused to fade. What if the government hadn't erased the identities of fallen soldiers by mistake? But by design? Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. A text message appeared from an unknown number. "Check your email." Code 47 to 21, heart pounding. She opened her inbox. One new message. No subject, no sender. Just a single link. Against every instinct, she clicked it. A secure folder opened. Images, documents, scanned reports. At the top, a file titled Operation Harvest, Confidential. Inside were personnel profiles, men listed as deceased in Vietnam, each marked reassigned for special duty, and among them, a photo she recognized instantly. Daniel Reeves. Except the caption didn't read Reeves. It read, Evans, David R., active until April 1973. Her breath caught. The date was a full year after his reported death. She scrolled further. One paragraph, half redacted, stood out in the report. Subject redeployed under new cover. Subsequent death classified as operational loss. Body unaccounted. Eleanor's vision blurred. It wasn't just Daniel. There were dozens of names, men listed as both dead and alive depending on which record you read. The government hadn't just erased them, it had repurposed them. A noise startled her, a faint click at the door. She turned sharply. The handle twitched once, then stopped. Silence. Her heart hammered in her chest. She backed toward the window, clutching the printed page in her hand. Outside, the night pressed close. Somewhere in the darkness below, a car engine idled. She whispered to herself almost without sound, if they could erase soldiers, what stops them from erasing anyone? The lights flickered once, then everything went black. Erasure or cover story. When the lights snapped back on, Eleanor was no longer sure if the power had failed, or if someone had turned it off. Her breath came shallow. The window glass reflected her pale face, eyes wide and unblinking, and in that, reflection. She saw the single printed page clutched in her fist, the proof she'd been chasing for months. She didn't sleep that night. She sat on the floor, back against the wall, waiting for dawn to cut through the heavy dark. By morning, she was on the first flight back to the mainland. In her bag were 3 copies of the Operation Harvest file, one sealed, one hidden, one to deliver. If the men listed there had been deliberately erased, it wasn't just a historical mystery anymore. It was an act of rewriting reality itself. She landed in D.C. under gray skies. The city always smelled of rain and bureaucracy. Her contact, a journalist named Tom Keller, met her in a small cafe near DuPont Circle. His hair was thinning, his notepad thick with names and dates. When she handed him the folder, his fingers hesitated before touching it. "I've seen rumors about this," he murmured. "Old intel projects, paper ghosts, but never proof." It's more than proof," she said. "It's people, soldiers, erased and reassigned. They died once on the field, and then again on paper." Keller flipped through the pages, his eyes widening at the photo of Reeves, David Evans, as the file named him. "If this is true, it means entire casualty records were falsified. That's a cover-up on a scale we've never proven." "Then let's prove it," she said. But the next words froze her. "We can't publish this yet. Half these names belong to intelligence operations that might still be classified. You'd bring down a storm you can't control." She stared at him. "You think the truth needs permission?" Keller sighed, rubbing his temples. "I'm saying be smart. If this was an intel cover, they won't protect you. They'll bury you with the same ink they used on them." Eleanor left without finishing her coffee. Later that evening, she sat on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, the city glowing soft and distant beyond the reflecting pool. She thought about the mother in Kansas whose son's name had vanished from the list, about the veterans who still woke from dreams of men who weren't supposed to exist. The truth, she realized, wasn't just buried. It had been rewritten line by line until it looked like honor. Her phone buzzed again. Unknown number. A text. "You're looking in the wrong archives. Try the agency records annex. Room 214. She didn't reply, but she went. The building was out past Arlington, behind a line of chain link and faded signage that said, "Federal Property, Restricted." Inside, the air was dry and cold. Fluorescent. Lights hummed overhead as she followed the hallway numbers. 210, 212, 214. The door was locked, but her temporary researcher badge, issued months earlier, still worked. The latch clicked open. The room was small and bare, except for a single table stacked with brown boxes. Each was marked with the same label, Directive 10A, Special Handling, Vietnam, 1969-73. Her hands trembled as she opened the first box. Inside were casualty reports, each stamped redacted. Then, under the next layer, something stranger. Field photographs. Dozens of them. Faces of soldiers, most too damaged to identify, but on the backs of several faint-penciled notes. Used, reassigned, shadow file created. One envelope was thicker than the rest. She slid out its contents and froze. It was a letter dated May 1971. Addressed to Department of Defense. Records Division. The subject line read, Reassignment of deceased personnel for psychological operations testing. She read each word carefully, her stomach twisting tighter with every line. The letter described a program in which select soldiers killed in action were posthumously used as ghost identities, cover aliases for agents deployed in regions where standard documentation would compromise security. The government had literally borrowed the dead. The letter ended with a single sentence that made her skin crawl. Public casualty listings adjusted accordingly. The air in the room felt heavy. She could hear her heartbeat echoing in her ears, every theory, every unanswered question. It all fit now. The vanished names, the false transfers, the sealed DNA reports. It wasn't just erasure. It was substitution. Behind her, the door creaked. She turned sharply. A man stood there, tall, wearing a plain gray suit, expression unreadable. "Ms. Shaw," he said evenly. "You shouldn't be here." Her throat tightened. "Who are you?" "Someone trying to save you from making a mistake." "Like saving Daniel Reeves?" His eyes flickered at the name. "You don't understand the scale of what you've touched. Operation Harvest wasn't a crime. It was containment." "Containment of what?" she demanded. He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "There were men in that war who didn't officially exist. Covert agents, psychological operatives. If their identities were exposed, it would have unraveled entire missions, endangered lives still in the field. Some were reclassified under dead soldiers' names to protect ongoing work. And the real families?" she asked. "The mothers who never got closure?" He looked down, almost regretful. They were collateral truth. Necessary silence. Eleanor's voice trembled. "So you admit it. The government erased its own dead." He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket and placed something on the table. A small dog tag, tarnished with age. "Reeves, Daniel M." She stared at it. "Where did you get this?" "He gave it to me," the man said quietly. "Before he died, in 1973. Her pulse hammered. "You're saying he was alive? You knew him?" "He wasn't the man you think he was." Reeves volunteered for a program he didn't fully understand. He wanted to help bring POWs home. They gave him a new name, new orders. When it went bad, they buried him under both. Her mind spun. "Why come to me now?" "Because someone reopened the file. Someone's leaking old data. You're in the crossfire, Ms. Shaw." He turned to leave, but she caught his sleeve. "Where is he buried?" He hesitated. "Not here." And then he was gone. That night, she sat in her car across from the archives building, the dog tag glinting faintly under the streetlight. She turned it over in her hand again and again, trying to imagine the man it once belonged to. The soldier, the agent, the ghost. She thought about how history could hide behind classified words, how erasure could look like protection, how truth could vanish with a single red stamp. She wanted to stop, to walk away. But she couldn't, because there was one more thing the man hadn't realized. When she took the letter from the folder, she'd noticed something else. A second sheet, pressed faintly beneath it. When she held it to the light, invisible ink began to surface. A faint map. Coordinates. One circle marked in red. It wasn't in Vietnam. It was in Nevada. A place the government claimed didn't exist. And as the night wind stirred the papers in her lap, she whispered to herself, "If the bodies weren't buried overseas, where are they?" The city lights blurred outside the windshield. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed. Eleanor started the engine and drove into the dark, not knowing that the answers waiting in that desert would change everything, and that some identities were erased not to hide the dead, but to protect the living. The price of a name. The Nevada desert stretched endlessly before her, a sea of scorched sand and silence. The highway shimmered in the heat, the kind of isolation where even thoughts seemed to echo. Eleanor's car hummed over the cracked asphalt, following the coordinates that had appeared under invisible ink. A ghost map leading to nowhere, or to something the government had buried so deep it might not want to be found. By the third hour, there were no signs of life, only a lone fence, miles from any road crowned with rusting barbed wire. A weathered sign read, "Federal Property. No entry." Beyond it, the desert rose into low hills and the vague outline of structures, hangars, or perhaps shelters bleached by time and wind. She parked, her heart thudding, and stepped into the heat. The silence felt unnatural, as if sound itself had been erased from this place. As she moved closer to the fence, she noticed something strange. Old military markers driven into the ground, numbered in sequence, 10A1, 10A2, 10A3. The same directive that had haunted every page of her investigation. The fence had a section where the wire hung loose. She slipped through and walked toward the nearest structure. It was half buried in the sand, the entrance sealed by a rusted metal door. The air smelled faintly of oil and dust. She hesitated, then pushed. The hinges groaned, and a wave of stale air rolled out. Old paper, disinfectant, and something metallic underneath. Inside, rows of filing cabinets stood under a thick film of dust. The labels were nearly illegible, but one caught her eye. Recovered personnel, 1970-73. She pulled the drawer open. Inside were plastic sleeves containing photos of soldiers, fingerprints, dental charts, and next to many of them, red stamps that read reassigned or restricted access. She kept digging. The further she went, the more disturbing it became. Beneath one stack of files lay small, sealed vials, samples labeled with initials and dates. Blood, hair, bone fragments. Each bore a corresponding soldier's name, but the paperwork showed something chilling. Several samples had been cross-matched to different identities. Eleanor whispered to herself, "They made new men out of the dead." At the far end of the room, a faded map was pinned to the wall. Red pins dotted Southeast Asia, Saigon, Da Nang, Quang Tri, and then a line of arrows stretched west across the Pacific, ending in Nevada. At the bottom, someone had scrawled in ink, "Processing chain complete. Subjects reassigned." She backed away from the map, her pulse rising. The weight of what she'd found settled in. This wasn't just an archive. It was the endpoint of an operation designed to cleanse the record, to rewrite the line between the living and the dead. Then she heard it. The faint crunch of footsteps outside. Eleanor froze, listening. Another sound followed, a low hum, mechanical, steady. She glanced toward the doorway and caught a glint of light reflecting off glass. A vehicle. She darted behind a row of cabinets, crouching low. The engine stopped. Silence pressed in again. Two voices drifted through the open door. Male, one calm, one irritated. Said it was sealed years ago. Then why is it open? Eleanor's fingers tightened around the camera in her pocket. She took one breath, then another, and snapped 3 quick photos of the vials and the files. Her heart hammered as she heard boots scraping closer. The calmer voice spoke again. "Shut it down. Take everything. No trace." A beam of flashlight cut across the room, sliding over the cabinets, and stopping inches from where she hid. She stayed still, barely breathing. Dust danced in the light like slow-falling ash. Then, a sudden vibration broke the silence. Her phone, buzzing faintly in her jacket. She snatched it out, silenced it, but the sound had already given her away. "Hey!" one voice shouted. The beam swung toward her. Eleanor ran. She bolted down the narrow hallway, the echo of footsteps chasing her. Light flared behind her as someone shouted again. She burst into daylight, the sun blinding, and sprinted toward the fence. Her lungs burned. A shout rang out, "Stop!" followed by the metallic click of a weapon being readied. But the desert had its mercy. A gust of sand whipped up, blurring sightlines, masking her escape. She threw herself into a dry gulch and crawled through the dust until the voices faded behind her. For a long time she lay still, heart pounding against the earth. When she finally looked up, the compound shimmered in the distance like a mirage. She could still see the glint of metal and movement, men gathering boxes, burning papers, erasing again. By nightfall she was back on the road, her camera clutched tightly. She drove until the stars vanished behind a veil of city light. In a motel outside Reno, she connected her camera to her laptop. The images loaded slowly, each one clearer than the last. The files, the map, the vials. Proof of what they'd done. Proof that the government had not only erased the identities of the fallen but recycled them into shadow operations no one had ever been told about. But the final photo stopped her cold. It wasn't one she remembered taking. It showed a single file left on the table after she fled. A close-up of a record marked Evans, David R. Shiu, terminated 1973. But below that, another name was faintly visible, written in red ink beneath the label as if someone had tried to scratch it out. Reeves Daniel M. Her hands shook. Whoever had taken that photo had been inside the room after she ran. She checked the photo metadata. The timestamp read only 30 minutes after she'd fled the base. Someone was following her. The next morning, she went to the Nevada State Archives, claiming to be a researcher cross-verifying Defense Department contracts. The clerk, a weary man with coffee-stained fingers, handed her a microfilm reel from 1973. "This is all we've got left from that quarter," he said. She loaded it into the viewer and began scrolling. Most of it was dull logistics reports, supply shipments, construction budgets. Then one frame made her stop. It was a brief memo addressed to the Department of Defense, marked Eyes Only. It read, "Subject, posthumous identity allocation. Status, 24 reassigned. 3 unresolved, 1 compromised." The attached note had a single name handwritten across the bottom margin. Reeves, compromised. She stared at the word. Compromised. Not deceased. Not missing. Compromised meant something or someone had broken the rules. Eleanor realized what it might mean. If Daniel Reeves had resisted whatever they'd turned him into, he might have tried to expose it. And maybe, just maybe, he'd left something behind. The thought wouldn't leave her. That night she drove west again, tracing old records, following any surviving clue of the compromised entry. One address surfaced. A facility long abandoned near Groom Lake, listed in one of Reeves' reassignment logs. She followed it until the road turned to dust, and the stars above felt close enough to touch. There was a gate, half collapsed, marked only by a faded military insignia, and beyond it, buried under sand and silence, a single marker stood crooked in the dirt. She brushed the dust away with trembling fingers. The engraving read DMR, 1971-1973. Unknown unit. No record found. No record. No trace. Just a name reduced to 3 initials. The wind howled low across the plain. Somewhere in the darkness behind her, an engine idled once more. Eleanor turned, frozen. Headlights flared on the horizon. She gripped the dog tag in her pocket, her pulse quickening. For a heartbeat she thought of running. Then the lights blinked once, twice, and went out. Silence. The desert swallowed the sound whole, leaving only the echo of her breath and the ghost of a soldier who might never have died, or might never have lived. And as the night stretched around her, she realized something terrifying. Maybe the U.S. government hadn't erased the identities of fallen Vietnam soldiers to hide what it lost, but to hide who it had created. The wind shifted again, carrying a whisper across the sand, soft and almost human. "Don't let me disappear twice." Then, darkness.